The Ambani wedding is finally over. Okay, it's actually not. But I'm not here to talk about that wedding, the one touted to be the grandest wedding of the century. But let's instead talk about the big problem in India, our obsession with over-the-top weddings. The Indian wedding industry is worth 10 lakh crores. That's $130 billion. It's second only to the food and grocery industry. On average, Indians spend twice as much on weddings as they do on education. So in this episode of Let Me Explain, let's take a critical look at India's wedding market, on how much Indians spend on weddings in proportion to their earnings and wealth, the debt traps that these weddings have become, and the many attempts to bring in laws to curb such expenditure. Let me explain. The Ambani wedding, which supposedly cost 5,000 crores, is a mere 0.5% of Mukesh Ambani's wealth. But I need to add here that this argument that it's their money and they can do whatever they want with it is not entirely right. The Ambani wedding had an obsession with scale. It was a lot about pushing brands, whether it's in-house designers or Reliance brands. Let's remember that wealth isn't something that grows in vacuum. It multiplies in a capitalistic monopoly enabled by various arms of the state. But as I already said, this video isn't really about the Ambani wedding. Why are big weddings a big problem in India? First off, there's a social pressure. In India, weddings aren't just about the couple. They're big social events which are watched closely and judged. And people feel the need to outdo each other with bigger and fancier weddings. By the way, here at the News Minute, we only try to outdo our own work. We're not in the business of just breaking news for the sake of it to be first and trying to outdo others. Because for us, journalism is about people and their stories. So if you like what we do, then do become a TNM subscriber. You can scan this QR code or click the link below. By the way, you also get access to Power Trip. It's a weekly political newsletter that my colleagues Tanya, Shabir and I bring only for TNM subscribers. Now back to the big Indian weddings. They create a huge financial strain on families. Poor and even middle-class families often take loans and end up buried in debt. This debt can haunt them for years, even affecting their ability to save. Statistics show us that weddings in India are getting grander and obviously more expensive. Every year, about 10 million weddings happen in India. That's 1 crore weddings. The average Indian wedding costs around $15,000. That's around 12.5 lakh rupees, which is way more than most annual household incomes. Indian couples usually spend twice as much on weddings as they do on education. The Indian wedding industry is rapidly expanding, growing at a rate of 25 to 30% every year. Data journalist Rukmini S., in her book Whole Numbers and Half Truths, has pointed out that wedding costs can vary. In poorest villages, they can be around 1 lakh rupees, while in small cities, they go up to 1.7 lakhs. Guess which two Indian states have the most expensive weddings? It's Kerala and Delhi. And the most educated people also tend to spend the most on weddings and dowries. This research shows that 60% of the families from marginalized communities end up taking loans from money lenders to fund these weddings. In the list of types of loans, a wedding loan is on top. This is according to India Lens, a financial service platform. And wedding loans averaged around 4.13 lakhs. The second in the list, by the way, was medical expenses. And mind you, this was in 2021, during the peak of second wave of COVID. A marriage loan or a wedding loan is offered by banks and financial institutions specifically to cover wedding expenses. These loans don't require any collateral or security. Approval is based on the applicant's income and credit worthiness. Marriage loans can range from 10,000 rupees to 40 lakh rupees, with interest rates between 10.5 and 37% per year. Loans are becoming debt traps, and people even kill themselves because of huge wedding loans. A 4-member family died by suicide in Chennai because they couldn't arrange funds for the elder daughter's wedding. A 31-year-old man from Delhi killed himself. The police found that he had taken a loan for his wedding and was unable to pay back. To avoid debt traps, tribal community leaders in Gujarat adopted mass weddings to tackle the financial burden. But let me tell you, hefty wedding loans are not just a rural phenomenon. Cities like Delhi, Mumbai, and Bangalore see a huge demand for wedding loans from banks. Interestingly, more and more millennials, about 42% of them, are planning to pay for their own weddings, according to this report by India Lens from 2023. When self-funding, 41% will dip into savings and 26% take personal loans. Even the length of weddings has been increasing. For example, events like Mehndi and Sangeet were never part of weddings in South and parts of East India. But thanks to movies and social media, most weddings now stretch over 4 to 5 days. And I'm not even talking about the extravagant weddings like the Ambanis or celebrity weddings like Deepika Ranveer or Priyanka and Nick Jonas, which by the way last even longer. So we know that India's wedding market is expanding. People are spending and borrowing more for weddings. But wedding expenses are not just about hosting events. Despite a stringent law, dowry continues in many forms. Of course, people term this as gifts to the groom or bride, or just bride's family's contribution. These gifts can be in form of cash, bikes, cars, land, house, jewelry, and any other innovatively guised material gifts. In 1961, that's 63 years ago, the Dowry Prohibition Act was passed. This law prohibits the practice of accepting and giving dowry, and those found guilty can be punished with imprisonment up to 6 months or with a fine. But that's not all. If dowry harassment leads to domestic violence, the punishment, if found guilty, is not less than 7 years and may even extend up to imprisonment for life. But despite this, the practice of dowry has continued. Dowry is prevalent among most Hindu castes and is practiced by other religions too. The bride often has no right over the gifts. Data journalist Rukmini has found that less than 20% of the women have their names on house papers. Only half have their names on a bank account. And just 10% can make major purchasing decisions for the household. In 2022 alone, the NCRB recorded 13,479 cases under the Dowry Prohibition Act of 1961. There were 6,450 dowry-related deaths that year. That's 17 women every single day dying because of dowry. Although there has been a slight decrease in these numbers compared to previous years, it still remains persistently high. It's no surprise that India is the world's second largest consumer of gold. The first, by the way, is China. Indians bought nearly 700 tons in 2019. And this report says that more than half of this demand is because of bridal jewelry. Many parents want to give their children their dream wedding, so they end up making big sacrifices like dipping into retirement savings and taking out expensive loans. And this pushes them into a tough cycle of debt, trying hard to pay off loans while managing everyday expenses long after the party is over. There have been many attempts in the past to bring in regulation to curb wasteful expenditure in weddings. A few of these bills propose that the government sets limits on the number of guests and relatives who can be invited to weddings. They also suggested capping the overall expenditure for weddings. A bill introduced by BSP Rajya Sabha MP Akhilesh Dasgupta said the upper limit for spending should be capped at 25% of the family's annual income, or 5 lakh rupees, whichever is lower. If someone wants to spend more than 5 lakh rupees, they must contribute 10% of the excess amount to a government welfare fund. In 2023, Congress MP Jaspreet Singh Gill proposed a bill limiting the number of attendees in a barat That's a procession for the groom to a maximum of 50 people. The bill suggested serving no more than 10 dishes at such events. Another key aspect of the bill is setting a cap of Rs 2,500 on the value of shagun, that's the gifts. In 2017, the Jammu and Kashmir government limited wedding guest numbers and food servings. They capped guests at 500 for daughters and 400 for sons. Kerala's Women's Commission too had proposed a legal framework in 2015 that wanted to restrict the total wedding expenses to 5 lakh rupees. Gold jewelry limited to 80 grams for the bride. And the guest list to be a maximum of 200 people was suggested. But the problem was that many of the proposals were unrealistic. The commission said that no more than 10,000 rupees can be spent on the bridal dress and 5,000 on the groom's attire, and just 100 rupees per plate for wedding feast, and 25,000 for the venue. Anyway, none of these proposals have materialized. Now, the problem with the Ambani wedding is also about the aspirations it creates. And for Indians who are already burdened with weddings, even if it may not be possible to replicate the Ambani wedding, it paints an unrealistic picture of what weddings should look like. That's it from me for this week. Do tell me what you thought of this episode, and do tell me that going forward, do you think that we can actually break this death cycle of the Indian weddings? Write to me at pooja@thenewsminute.com with your suggestion, with your feedback, with your criticism, and also give me ideas for my next episode.